The next item of business is debate on legislative consent motion 21322 in the name of Michael Russell on the UK coronavirus bill. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion. Up to 5 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Less than a week ago, I updated the Chamber on the introduction by the UK Government of the coronavirus bill, setting out the measures the bill contains and how it will assist and support our responses to the current pandemic. On Friday, the Scottish Government lodged the legislative consent motion with the Parliament. In respect to the bill, this afternoon members are now debating the motion and will be asked to give it its consent with the recommendation of the Scottish Government. I acknowledged in my statement last week that timings around the development, introduction and scrutiny of the bill had been and would continue to be extremely challenging. The UK Government's stated ambition was to have the bill receive royal assent by the end of this month. This has now been accelerated in view of the current scenario, and the intention is for all stages of the bill to be completed by tomorrow, when royal assent will hopefully take place. Last week, I gave a commitment to the Scottish Government that we will institute, after discussion across the Parliament, appropriate reporting on how and when the powers in the bill have been used by the Scottish Parliament. In addition, in our own further emergency coronavirus legislation, next week I intend to embed such reporting and renewal for every 6 months, included in our use of provisions in the UK bill in law. I'm glad to say that since our discussions last week, the UK Government has heeded the concerns that have been widely raised on the 6 months issue, and I understand are implementing that in their bill. This bill, Presiding Officer, is a result of a great deal of intensive work between the Government and the devolved administrations. We must continue that mutual cooperation as we work collectively as part of our four nations approach to confront the extraordinary public health and economic challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic. But we will also take the actions we regard as necessary for the special circumstances in Scotland and to put those in place. And it's to those that I want to turn now. The First Minister has made it clear, and I want to repeat, that in creating the additional powers in this bill, we did not and do not mean automatically to use them. We'll be guided by the decisions at the appropriate time, and any enforcement action that we take will be taken as a result of the situation actually pertaining here in Scotland. Of course, since I gave the statement last Thursday, the Prime Minister and the First Minister have, as part of our response, set out further social distancing measures, the latest to have been implemented with immediate effect from midnight last night. The restrictions now in place will be difficult, sometimes distressing. They will always be strange to us. But these new measures are for the protection of us all, and they are essential, and I repeat, essential, to slow down the spread of the virus. From today, the message to all our citizens is clear. People must now stay at home. The more people that comply, the less impact there is on the NHS, and the fewer people will die. We're now clearly telling all citizens those facts, and there's a very restricted list of activities. Leaving the house is permitted to go shopping and for one form of exercise a day, but this must be severely restricted, and the exercise is expected to be undertaken alone or with your household. Leaving the house is permitted for any medical need, to provide care or to help a valuable person, and for travelling to and from work where that is absolutely, and I stress absolutely, necessary and cannot be done from home. Now, we have been explicitly clear that beyond these permitted activities, heavy restrictions now apply. All non-essential retail outlets will no longer be allowed. All social events, weddings, baptisms and other ceremonies are also no longer permitted, and communal places such as libraries, playgrounds and places of worship will close. Funerals must be restricted to immediate family. We'll shortly issue a list of premises covered by these new measures, but we urge everyone to do the right thing now. Most have, but we are, and I stress this again, committed to use the powers available to us, and we will. We have therefore, Presiding Officer, now taken the decision, as part of our response, to commence upon royal assent the powers within the bill, which will ensure that all necessary enforcement action can be taken to implement social distancing and restrictions on gathering, events and operation of business activity without further delay. And to do so, following the point at which the bill completes its parliamentary process and receives royal assent, which is likely to be tomorrow, we will immediately bring forward regulations under the emergency procedure in this Parliament. These regulations will be made in what is now Schedule 19 of the bill, which confers the same powers on the Scottish Government that the UK Government already has under Section 45C of the Public Health Control of Diseases Act 1984. Those powers allow us to make emergency regulations where we believe there is an urgent need for them. We believe there is an urgent need, and we will make those regulations now. That means those regulations will come into force immediately and will remain in force, providing they are approved by Parliament within 28 days of being made. So we will seek parliamentary approval as soon as possible for that timetable. Of course, we will keep them under constant review in line with our scientific advice, and will assure Parliament is kept informed of our legislative approach as things progress. And I will be meeting, I think, opposition spokespeople later this afternoon to talk about the next bill we intend to bring. Presiding Officer, when I addressed the Chamber last week, I said we must put in place what we need to do the right thing for everyone, to take action to protect, to enhance and strengthen not just our response, but ourselves. I think the measures we have taken are proportionate but essential. But last week also, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I drew attention to the fact that pandemics have been experienced before. Each time there is fear, there is dread, there are difficult decisions, and yes, there is death. But there's also courage and hope and determination. We learn from those who have gone before us because they made it through and they told the tale. And we intend to do the same.
Could you move the motion, please, Cabinet Secretary?
The motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Bruce Crawford on behalf of the Finance and Constitution Committee for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We find ourselves in quite exceptional circumstances, considering a bill and a legislative consent memorandum that seeks extraordinary powers in an effort to keep our communities, our families, all of us safe. I think we all know governments would only normally be seeking such powers in times of war. We also know that right now we are in a war against an unseen and deadly enemy. As a result, MSPs and MPs are understandably inundated by emails and calls from constituents. Constituents anxious, concerned and scared about the impact COVID-19 may have on their health, their families, their friends and their livelihoods. The bill and its accompanying LCM aims to help governments to support and protect us at this time of great need by increasing the available health and social care workforce, easing the burden on frontline staff, containing and slowing the virus, managing the deceased with respect and dignity, supporting people and maintaining the food chain. In view of the wide range of powers in the LCM, the Finance and Constitution Committee was designated as the lead committee as we considered the Coronavirus Bill LCM this morning. I can confirm that the committee has recommended to Parliament that it should agree the draft motion as set out in the LCM. We have written to the Scottish Government confirming our decision. The LCM covers a wide range of policy areas, including health, social care, justice and business. The LCM identifies that the powers will come out operational in a variety of ways. In some areas, existing legislation is amended so that powers will come into force upon enactment. In other areas, the powers will only become operational once certain conditions are met. For example, Scottish ministers will be able to give directions to impose restrictions in relation to events, gatherings and premises. In relation to those areas where the powers may be more reactive to changing circumstances, I would welcome information as to how the Scottish Government is working with others, such as the local government and the police, to help inform its decisions on when to implement these powers. At the committee this morning, the Cabinet Secretary dealt with a very significant range of issues, and I think was able to respond concisely and with clarity, from matters about who is a key worker to the security of food supplies, from the impact on the vulnerable to the need for employers to act responsibly. As the Cabinet Secretary explained last week, creating these powers does not automatically mean that they will be used. He repeated that again today, or that all the powers will be implemented at the same time as the bill gains royal assent. And the bill does tread a fine line between allowing flexible public health response and ensuring that human rights and civil liberties are not unnecessarily infringed upon. And key to ensuring this balance remains appropriate will be the transparency which these additional powers are in practice exercised. And key to ensuring that this balance remains appropriate, we need this, as the Cabinet Secretary said this morning, now is the time for democratic process to be stepped up. Presiding Officer, this LCM seeks to enable the government and allow it to react quickly, to protect us, and in particular those most vulnerable to this terrible virus. It seeks a wide range of powers, but these are unprecedented times. I would urge members to support the motion. Let's give our governments the powers to help them win the war against this unseen and deadly enemy. And can I say to the people of Scotland, stay safe, keep well, and let our marvellous NHS do all their powers to save us. And please, stay at home when you can.
I call Bill Bowman on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I speak as convener of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. We discussed this bill at our meeting this morning, though of course, given the urgency of this situation, our consideration was limited. The committee is interested in this bill in relation to the powers to make legislation that are being delegated to Scottish ministers. Of these, the power that the committee considered to be the most significant was that which allows Scottish ministers to make regulations for the purpose of preventing, protecting against, controlling or providing a public health response to the incidence of or spread of infection or contamination. This power is necessarily broad, given the wide range of responses that may be required to control an outbreak. However, the bill puts in place important and appropriate restrictions on the use of the power. The committee is also reassured that the affirmative procedure, or made affirmative in cases of urgency, applies. This, we think, strikes the right balance between allowing government to act quickly and allowing Parliament to scrutinise these actions. There are also significant direction-making powers being delegated to Scottish ministers in this bill. While this is not something that the committee must consider in relation to LCMs, it is something that the committee would have liked to explore more under ordinary circumstances. We are, however, mindful of the extreme circumstances in which we are currently operating and the need for government to act swiftly. The committee also notes that the substantial powers delivered by the bill, both legislative and direction-making, are appropriately time-limited to a specified emergency period. This will allow the government to act to address this unprecedented situation, but does not allow these powers to be retained indefinitely. The committee considers this an appropriate balance. These are unprecedented times, and we hope that these powers can help government in addressing this pandemic. Thank you.
Call Murdo Fraser for up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This will be a short debate, so I'd like to make a brief contribution on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives and signal at the outset that we will support the legislative consent motion at decision time this evening. It is, in my view, essential that both the UK Government and the Scottish Government have the emergency powers they need to tackle the unprecedented national crisis that we are now facing. The UK Parliament bill that this LCM relates to is aimed at protecting the nation's public health and ensuring that NHS and social care staff are supported to deal with significant extra pressure. It also contains a number of measures to ensure that the public are protected. As Bruce Crawford said earlier, in normal times there would be concerns about the reach of some of the measures before us. There would be perfectly legitimate concerns about civil liberties. I fully recognise and understand these concerns, and under normal circumstances many of the powers contained in this legislation would not be deemed acceptable. But we are not dealing with normal circumstances. We are dealing with exceptional circumstances, and it is right that governments do have the powers contained in this bill, powers which normally, in a liberal democracy, we believe would go too far in the balance between individual freedom and the power of government. And a good example of that is what the Cabinet Secretary just signalled in terms of the emergency powers he intends to take to restrict public gatherings to avoid the spread of infection. In normal times, we would regard that as overreach by government. In these times, it is a necessary step to take to protect the public. The measures in this bill fall into 5 categories: containing and stopping the virus, easing legislative and regulatory requirements, enhancing capacity across essential services, managing the deceased in a dignified way, and supporting and protecting the public. It is important to state that there are many powers government already has to deal with the situation we are now in, where legislation is not required. It's also important to state that the bill is time-limited. Initially, it was proposed that this would be for 2 years, and there were, of course, concerns, quite legitimate concerns, about whether that period was appropriate. And like the Cabinet Secretary, I am pleased that the UK Government has now agreed that this period should be reduced to 6 months, with a provision that this should be extended if possible. And that's a very welcome approach and shows that the Government has been listening to the concerns that were raised. Crucially, this is also a bill that respects the devolution settlement and has been drawn up with the full agreement of and in consultation with the Scottish Government and the other devolved administrations. Presiding Officer, there's a great deal I could say about the detail of the bill before us, but what we've already heard in this debate from the speakers before me gives us a flavour of the measures that are required. They are, in my view, appropriate, proportionate, and only to be used where strictly necessary. And I think these principles should also underline our own legislation here in this Parliament, which the Cabinet Secretary will introduce next week. It needs to be proportionate, it needs to be evidence-based, it needs to be as tightly drawn as possible, and it needs to be time-limited. And I think that's important, given the lack of opportunity there will be for detailed parliamentary scrutiny and for external consultation about the impact of the measures being proposed. Presiding Officer, a priority in the bill is the protection of life and ensuring that NHS and social care staff are supported to deal with the significant extra pressure they are under. We do need to remove the bureaucratic hurdles that stand in the way of bringing new people into the NHS, including those who are recently retired, and ensure that hospital space is freed up and frontline staff are given the space to focus on caring for the sick. Presiding Officer, I said at the outset we are living in unprecedented times. These require an unprecedented response, where the whole of the United Kingdom works together to tackle the crisis before us. It is essential that the peak of the virus is delayed, preferably until the summer months, where the NHS is typically under less pressure. These measures in the bill today will help achieve that outcome. And for all these reasons, I believe that Parliament should unanimously pass the legislative consent motion before us. Thank you.
Alec Rowley, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Labour will also be supporting the Government today. And I would want to put on record my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for the cross-party dialogue that has taken place today with this bill. I think it's important, as he brings forward the Scottish Government's bill, that continues, and I know that he intends to. As the First Minister said earlier today, given the type of legislation that we are putting through and the speed at which we're doing it, it will be important. Scrutiny will be important more now than ever. And I think that's why Richard Leonard's right to say that although we are not calling for additional meetings to take place within this Parliament, the very idea that this Parliament would go off on a 2 weeks recess in the middle of this crisis, I think would not be seen well by the public. We should be able to hold the Government to account in whatever form or shape that needs to take. So I think for the powers that be, that's an important message that we need to send across. I do believe that there is still a lot of uncertainty out there when it comes to key workers and who are key workers, and it's important that we continue to monitor. I accept that everything that's happening is happening with the best intentions to deal and tackle with this this crisis. But that said, we need to be able to keep on top of, and where things are not working, then address them quickly. I mentioned to the Cabinet Secretary this morning that I'd been contacted by the joint trade unions in Fife, who were very concerned that their members on the front line of health and social care did not have the proper protection and the resources to be able to do that job. And as they pointed out to me, that's a risk for their members, for the vulnerable people that they are caring for, and for all their families. So that needs to be addressed. But we also need to understand about the supply chain and who it is that's coordinating and ensuring that that coordination. And it's right that every individual elected member in this chamber is able to push and ask those questions and raise concerns directly where these issues are coming up. I was pleased that the Cabinet Secretary said this morning that the Health Secretary had already reached a deal with the private sector and private hospitals in Scotland. And if that is the case, that is good, because the whole resource of Scotland needs to be pooled together. But there are within this bill powers, the food chain emergency liaison group, etc. But we need to keep an eye on. People have panic bought over these last weeks or so. If that doesn't stop, then we need to be clear that we are willing to take whatever action is necessary to put a stop to that. And we need to also be having a good relationship with the supermarkets. But, you know, for the number of elderly people that have emailed me saying they're having difficulties in accessing food, if some kind of priority scheme was put in with the supermarkets in delivery, and if necessary, further resources for councils going in to make that happen, most people who are self-isolating would be able to access the food. It's not for lots of these people that they've not actually got the money to buy the food. It is that they just can't get access to the food. So there will be practical things that I believe, if we sit down with the supermarkets and push them and work with them, we'll be able to address. With that, as I say, I'm pleased with the cross-party working that is taking place on this. Let's keep it up there, and let's get the message out to people that to act collectively and sensibly.
Patrick Harvey, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Greens will also support the legislative consent motion. And I say that as someone who's got a long-standing grievance, and I know that word is sometimes used pejoratively, with the legislative consent process. I think it's been made relatively meaningless in recent years. But in these circumstances, I think we have a responsibility to take the legislation seriously, and we will agree to the legislative consent motion. I don't think any of us should be happy doing so. This is not the kind of bill that any of us would wish to be passing, but it is necessary. I don't pretend, though, that it's ideal even in these circumstances, and there was much that I was looking for when I saw the bill for the first time that isn't in there. I would have wanted not just an expansion in the eligibility for statutory sick pay, but an increase in the level to that which is closer to something that's livable that a lot of our neighbouring countries already have. Better still, the application of a universal basic income as the clearest and simplest way to give everybody a basic safety net in these emergency circumstances. That's not in there, and I would urge anyone who has colleagues at Westminster, as I have one colleague in the House of Commons, to make the case for improvements to the bill on this and other matters. I was surprised to see that in relation to food supplies, there are only provisions in relation to the providing of information. And I don't know whether we'll be in a situation in the coming weeks when public authorities will need to have the power to acquire stocks of food or other emergency supplies, such as hygiene supplies, to distribute them to the public. But it may be possible that we'll need those powers. Certainly there is a need for measures to prevent price gouging and exploitation of those who control those supplies, which I don't think at the moment applies to the big retailers, but we've all seen it happening in some places where certain absolutely critical supplies are being price hiked. I've made reference before to the emergency volunteer provisions, which are in the bill, which give a commitment that there'll be remuneration for loss of earnings for those who sign up as emergency volunteers. But of course, we already know there are people who've already lost their jobs, who will be available and willing and potentially skilled and talented people to be emergency volunteers. There's nothing in the bill that allows remuneration for them. That would meet their economic need as well as the social need for those volunteers to be available. And I would also encourage the government, I know this isn't part of the devolved aspects that are covered by the LCM, but in the government's discussions with the UK government, I would encourage them to make the case to ensure that our asylum seekers in Scotland and elsewhere are protected. Detention, deportation, these things are frankly intolerable in the current circumstances. They would be deeply dangerous. And for anyone in asylum accommodation to be faced, as they have been in recent months, with the prospect of lock change evictions would also be intolerable. I agree that we have there's welcome changes to the renewal period, but there are other potential unintended consequences of this, and members will know that the Commissioner for Children and Young People, many disability and care organisations and others have talked about the fears that are being generated. None of us know how long these emergency powers will last, and those people, including many disabled people, whose quality of life is directly dependent on how the law deals with these issues, have genuine fears about what is to come, and the Scottish Government must address those fears and allay them. Finally, Presiding Officer, I do very warmly welcome the announcement that we heard earlier today from Aileen Campbell that the devolved emergency legislation will include provisions on ensuring that evictions in the private rented sector and elsewhere do not take place. We'll work with the Scottish Government to improve those provisions if we can, because this is not just about the accrual of arrears. We don't want people coming out of this process with unpayable debts. We want to make sure that people are protected in terms of rents as well as a secure home to live in these dangerous times. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Willie Rennie, up to 4 minutes, please.
I thought Bruce Crawford summed it up very well to start off with when he said this was an unseen, deadly enemy and that we need to work in partnership to defeat it. I thought he summed it up very well. To stay home, protect the NHS, save lives, the kind of slogan that I think will become part of our daily language over the next few months. We need proportionate powers, and we agree that these powers in this bill are proportionate, considering the crisis. As a Liberal, I'm nervous about the extent of powers in normal times, but I think considering the challenge, I think this is what is necessary. It's not to wield a big stick to the population, but to ensure life is possible and to ensure that the reckless few cannot threaten the lives of the many. It is therefore reassuring that the Minister and the Government will seek the 6-month renewal process and that will only use the powers when they determine that it is absolutely necessary in Scotland's circumstances at the time. That is reassuring, and the fact that the Minister will come back on a regular basis and to report on how these powers are being used and exercised. I welcomed the announcement yesterday from the UK Government to go for the 6-month renewal as well. I thought that was a sensible compromise and an indication of, I think, the partnership approach that we've got across the parties and across the parliaments, right across the United Kingdom, addressing this crisis, and that is in no doubt welcome. In addition to the measures to protect us from the reckless few, it is also about adopting more flexibility in the way that government works and improving standards too. So I would like the Minister to perhaps address some concerns from organisations like Inclusion Scotland, who are anxious about the issue of care assessments. I know that the packages can proceed without the care assessments, but these care assessments are there for a purpose. They're there to provide a comprehensive assessment of all the individuals' needs, these vulnerable people. So if it's possible to do the assessments, I hope the Minister will encourage those people applying the assessments to do so. We understand they will be under inordinate pressure over the next few months. But if the assessments can be done, we should encourage them to be done, because I think everybody will benefit from that process. The Scottish Specific Bill is coming next week. And I appreciate the engagement from the Minister, the discussion that we had last week about what's going to be in the bill itself. Does the Minister believe that that bill itself may provide some kind of process to address any emerging flaws that come from the UK bill? And I understand that there may be other legislation coming forward in future weeks, and I hope perhaps that we adopt that learning approach, that if we discover that improvements can be made, that we do accept that in future legislation. And finally, I look forward to the day that we can repeal this legislation so that we can return to the freedoms that we all enjoy. I think it is important to understand during this quite oppressive period that for a long time we have enjoyed those freedoms, and the sooner we get back to them, the better. Thank you.
We move to the open debate and speeches of 4 minutes, please. John McAlpine, followed by Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. If anyone has any doubts that this bill is necessary, I would just say...
Excuse me, Ms McAlpine, pull up your microphone.
Apologies.
Start again. Thank you.
If anyone has any doubts that this bill is necessary, I would say just one word, and that is Italy. Italy has an excellent health service, not unlike our own NHS, and the country's latest tally reported a total of 6,078 deaths from 63,928 infections. But the headline figures themselves do not tell the whole story. The people who die in Italy die alone among strangers without the comfort of their loving families, as they will here if our NHS is overwhelmed. For some people, dying alone is a prospect more frightening even than death itself, but that's the inevitable consequences if we don't take action. We must stay at home, and those who don't stay at home should be compelled to do so. The bill itself is extensive, and I cannot address each part of it, so I'll touch on 3 areas quickly. I commend the measures to enable the registration of doctors and other health professionals, and I want to draw attention to the briefing from the BMA on this part of the bill. They have written to 15,000 doctors to let them know that they expect the government to use their powers to ask the BMA to temporarily register them, and 1,500 of those have a registered address in Scotland. I think we need to look at that in the context of Italy again, where 14 doctors have already died and 3,700 doctors and nurses have already been infected on duty. And I just want to say one thing to those doctors and nurses who are going to register again and the ones already in our NHS. Thank you so much. The Cabinet Secretary says we will not necessarily use all the powers that the bill enables, but I know that ministers do need to use powers to protect these workers and that this Parliament supports them. I also wanted to touch on the powers in relation to food security. Those from reading the bill seem to focus on the sharing of information. I welcome that, but as I said earlier in my question to the First Minister, there really is a concern about the getting food to elderly and vulnerable people, particularly through home deliveries. And if we need to use powers in the bill, indeed if there are powers in the bill to enable ministers to intervene in that area, I think I would support them. And judging from comments from other members of Parliament, I would certainly support the use of those powers to ensure that the food goes to the people who need it. One aspect of the bill that does concern me, and others have raised it, is the care of the most vulnerable. And I note the briefing from Inclusion Scotland that represents people with disabilities. Clauses 15 and 16 of the bill are intended to increase flexibility for social care decision-making during the period in which the provision is in force. And it does this by allowing local authorities not to comply with the particular assessment duties where complying would not be practical. However, Inclusion Scotland warn that in reality the removal of these duties may result in many disabled people receiving social care support that is inadequate to meet their needs, receiving care that's inappropriate or in inappropriate settings, or maybe even receiving no social care at all. We're already hearing anecdotal evidence about the knock-on effects of on social care packages from the current crisis, and I would implore ministers to keep a very close eye on this and other unintended consequences that could affect the most vulnerable. Yes, there are human rights implications, but the ECHR allows exceptions when these are proportionate. I am very, very pleased that the amendment went through, which means that the legislation will be revised in 6 months. I wouldn't underestimate the profound implications on our human rights, but at times of national emergency, this is necessary, and this is a time of national emergency. I think it was Bruce Crawford earlier on that compared this current situation to a war, time of war, and I would agree with that. And this bill is designed to protect our frontline troops in that war, and that's why I support it. Thank you very much.
Ruth Davidson, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. For me, this bill and the legislative consent motion that we debate is about one thing and one thing only. It's about trust. It is about trusting the UK and Scottish governments to make decisions on behalf of all of us. And more, it is about handing the current inhabitants of Butte House and Number 10 unprecedented power and trusting them to wield it wisely. It is about trusting our police when handed enormous powers of shutdown, of penalty and arrest at a time of reduced scrutiny, to wield those powers virtuously. And it is about trusting individual officers to practice self-restraint when far fewer external checks are placed upon them. We are asking the public to trust their politicians at a time pre-COVID when trust was a vanishing commodity, when the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index recorded politicians as the least trusted profession of all behind bankers, journalists and estate agents. It is about recognising that behind the job title of politician are people who are every bit as worried for their family, concerned for the nation and desperate to keep the death toll to a minimum. And it's about recognising that the trust you put in them does not exist in a vacuum. Those politicians, in turn, are having to trust each other. Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford, Arlene Foster, Michelle O'Neill. 5 people, 5 different parties, 5 political heritages in conflict with each other, who have put old enmities aside to ensure that we pull together in a 4-nation strategy in order to have the best chance of getting through this. Whose trust in the decisions that they are having to make is reinforced by the trust that they have in the people who are advising them. The Chief Medical Officers, Chris Whitty and Catherine Calderwood, the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, the National Clinical Director, Jason Leach. The measures we are trusting governments to take go far beyond anything that in normal times we all believe is appropriate for Western liberal democracies to still be called such. But these are not normal times. One of the reasons that I'm a Conservative is because I believe in the agency of individuals, that in a democracy, sentient adults should enjoy the freedom to make decisions they feel are best for themselves and their family, as long as they accept responsibility for the decisions that they take. I don't accept the creeping hand of state bureaucracy into every area of my life, stifling and suffocating free expression. In a world of competing philosophies, I find myself in personality and belief and in conviction closer to Mill's harm principle, where the state shouldn't intervene except to stop harm to others. But all of this is suspended as we turn to face this enormous invisible wave which is about to wash over all of us. This is no longer a time to argue for the exercise of individual freedoms. It is a time to accept that the best route to the greatest freedom of all, life, is utilitarianism. I believe that the only moral position we have is that decisions taken in the weeks to come can only be decided on what will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. When a threat is so great, when it is so overwhelming, then the state is the only actor that is big enough to co-opt, coordinate, compel and direct all the multicoloured strands of our response. We have to give over our freedoms, purposefully and willingly, to the government and trust them to keep us safe. And after that great wave has receded once again, we have to trust them to hand those freedoms back. Presiding Officer, I thank the ministers of both government for the work that they are doing on all our behalves. I trust them to exercise the power and agency that I hand to them as a citizen of this country judiciously. And I ask them, please, to do their best work and to keep our families and our communities safe. Thank you.
Holly McNeill, followed by Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin with a heartfelt thanks to the committee, to all the government ministers, the First Minister, and Aileen Campbell in particular this afternoon, who I think made the right decision on no evictions. We live in the starkest of times, as Joan McAlpine said earlier, and we need the fullest extent of our powers now, our resources, our joint working. But as we've heard, people are still going to work and disobeying the guidance only this morning. And so the message must get through loud and clear today that you can no longer do that. If there's one power that I could add to prevent even further chaos, is a power to prevent traders, a small number of traders, who are escalating the prices of basic goods like hand sanitizers and toilet rolls in the middle of an unprecedented crisis. And I asked the Minister, would it even be possible to consider this? State intervention would be justified, in my view, in this crisis. As Ruth Davidson says, the legislation must be clear, it must be constantly reviewed, because we live in difficult times. And the Minister rightly says we act as 4 nations working together cross-party. The public expect clarity. They expect an understanding on why there's a lockdown for 3 weeks. And so we need emergency powers and new powers to ensure that we can function in these difficult times. With all the pressures and burdens on ministers and officials, we do need regular updates and reports on a number of things. Some of those things include what the legislation talks about, mental health orders, for example. Transparency in planning and contingency decisions are paramount to retaining public trust. The third sector has put out a particular plea as they're very concerned about resources, and there's an important briefing by the Alliance. Let's not forget the important work that our third sector do. Just some of the things that this bill does: has the powers to close schools, school boards, school accommodation for quarantine purposes, for the use of educational establishments and for public health protection. It confers powers on constables and immigration officers who can be enlisted to remove potentially infectious persons to a suitable place for screening. There can be a period of detention for up to 24 hours, and the person must be informed for the reason for their detention. It can apply to a child, and the requirement rests in a responsible adult. A person committing an offence, if they fail without reasonable excuse to comply with any of the directions, the reasonable instructions, can be forced to do so. Scottish ministers may give directions relating to events and gatherings in premises, as we've heard, but it's important to get across to the public that these are powers that can only be used in the middle of this public health crisis. And I think Ruth Davidson made a really important point that we must reassure the public that it's a temporary measure until we're over this, and at the end of it, normal society will continue. Clause 34 modifies Section 40 of the NHS Act, talking about vaccinations and immunisation administered by medical practitioners or persons under their direction to be removed, and that is to broaden the arrangements that Scottish ministers can make, if necessary, to decide who can immunise and vaccinate people. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the bill, as Bruce Crawford says, creates a fine line between protecting lives and normal freedoms and human rights. We hope and believe this will be temporary and that normal life will resume if we all work together, believe together and stay at home and support our medical services in doing amazing work during this crisis. Thank you.
And the last of the open debate contributions is from Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I realise time is short, so I'll keep it very brief. Just to raise some direct concerns with the Minister. Of course, we support the legislation, but to say that we should review after 3 months, not just wait for the 6-month period, but actually a full review after 3 months. Secondly, the Minister will have seen there was concerns, particularly in England and Wales, around the proposal of forced cremations. I'm glad there's been an amendment to that legislation. Can he give a commitment and a guarantee that there will be no circumstances in which anyone will be cremated against their family's will here in Scotland? I think that would be a reassurance that we welcome. Third, I welcome the Food Chain Emergency Liaison Group that is as part of this legislation, although, as Patrick Harvey has pointed out, it's about communication rather than actually forcing the staying open of supply chains. Will the Scottish Government and indeed Scottish associations be part of that Food Chain Emergency Liaison Group to make sure there is a free flow of supply up to Scotland? Fourth, there is issues around human rights. So there's clearly issues around sectioning of individuals around the Mental Health Act. There is issues around what's reported to the Procurator Fiscal when there is a death in the NHS setting. There are issues around the emergency registration of health workers. There's issues around fast tracking of Disclosure Scotland applications and the load that might be put on to all of that. What work has been done to make sure we can safeguard and maintain human rights at a time when we're asking people to do so much more with less and less workforce? And if there is a real increase in the number of applications going into Disclosure Scotland, what backup measures have been put in place to make sure there's an adequate workforce to be able to do that important work so we can get people on the front line as quickly as possible. In conclusion, this is legislation that, again, we don't want, we don't wish we had to introduce, but it's important legislation nonetheless to make sure we have the right response to this crisis. And I hope, like has been the case up until now, we can continue to have the active dialogue between members of this Parliament and the Scottish Government and the Scottish Government and the UK Government. If any unintended consequences were to take place from this legislation, that they could be addressed appropriately.
We move now to the closing contributions, and Monica Lennon, followed by Adam Tompkins. 4 minutes, please, Ms Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary opened this debate by saying that the restrictions that came into effect at midnight last night will feel difficult and strange to many of us, but I agree with him that those measures and the powers in this bill are essential to slow down the virus. Responding for Scottish Labour, Alec has made clear that the Government has our full support in the battle against COVID-19. And I know in recent weeks, many of us in the public have talked about possible draconian measures and talked about lockdown as something scary, but I think Willie, Rennie expressed it really well on behalf of the Liberal Democrats when he said it's not about wielding a big stick, but making sure that life is possible. And I thank Bruce Crawford and the committee for their work. Bruce Crawford was right to say that these are extraordinary powers and that our democratic processes need to be stepped up at this time. And he is right that the bill treads a fine line between public health and our civil liberties not being infringed upon. And others have talked about trust and about transparency and about scrutiny to make sure that we get this right. And I think Ruth Davison was right to say that these are unprecedented powers, but we all understand why and support the government's endeavours. Murdo Fraser was right when he said that the NHS and our social care staff, this bill is about supporting them to make sure that they can deal with the additional significant pressures that are coming their way. So yes, I agree with other members that in normal times this would be overreach, but these are not normal times. There are safeguards. The bill is time limited and will be renewed every 6 months, and colleagues have talked about their willingness to uphold our democracy and to be involved in that important scrutiny work. We will continue to ask questions. A number of colleagues have touched on the questions and concerns that have been raised outside the chamber, including from Alliance, Scottish Care and many mental health charities. So we know that we can't take our eye off the ball. The emergency legislation covers a range of areas, and that's because the health service alone can't solve this crisis. The purpose of the legislation is to relieve pressure on our health service. That is the driving force, so that as many lives as possible can be saved. But it's clear we need a collective approach to this crisis, and that will require every part of government to work together and all of us to support that work. I know that time is short, Presiding Officer. Many colleagues have touched on really important issues just a moment ago, and asked Sarwar seeking that clarity and that reassurance for some people in our community who are concerned about the provisions in the bill, which change burials and funerals as we know them. This bill and the measures that are being taken from cradle to grave are going to change life as we know it just now. Baptisms are already on hold, weddings have been postponed, attendance at funerals and those final farewells is going to be restricted to a few loved ones. So these are extraordinary powers, these are unprecedented times, but our job here is to do everything we can to support our NHS, to uphold democracy, provide that ongoing scrutiny. And my appeal to my constituents, to my friends and family, is that our NHS needs us like never before. We need our NHS like never before, and we all need each other like never before. So please stay at home, protect your loved ones and help to save lives.
Adam Tompkins, up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to reflect a little bit in these remarks on the nature of emergency power and human rights. And Ruth Davidson talked about John Stuart Mill. I'm going to go even further back and start with Cicero. In times of emergency, Presiding Officer, necessity becomes the only test against which we judge the laws. Our usual standards of reasonableness or proportionality do not apply. If there really is an emergency, we do what is necessary to defeat its causes and to manage its consequences. And when I say we, I do not mean only the government, I mean all of us. Every citizen has a duty to do what is needed, in the old language, in defence of the realm. Or in short, we, all of us, do what we need to do for the public good. All of this applies, Presiding Officer, only if there genuinely is an emergency. We are only too familiar, unfortunately, with governments claiming the need for emergency powers when there really is no emergency at all, just an opportunity. But that is emphatically not the case here. There is no doubt that we face the gravest threat to public health and the gravest threat also to our economic health and well-being that we have seen in our lifetimes. And there is, of course, concern about the scope of the extraordinary powers that this bill contains. Powers to ban events and public gatherings that impede our freedom of movement. Powers to detain those who are suspected of being infectious, which are a significant interference with our right to liberty. Freedom of movement, freedom of public assembly, and the right to liberty are modern human rights. Are our ancient conventions that come from Cicero about necessity and emergency powers negated by modern human rights law? Well, no, Presiding Officer, they are not. Indeed, they are accommodated within our modern human rights law. Properly understood, there need be no conflict between emergency powers and human rights. For example, one of our most fundamental human rights is the right to life. It's in Article 2 of the European Convention, and it's enshrined, of course, in the United Kingdom's Human Rights Act. It's a powerful right because it imposes broad-ranging and wide-sweeping duties on governments and public authorities, duties to protect life. In an emergency such as this, if it is necessary to detain infectious persons so as to protect life, so be it. Likewise, if it is necessary to ban events or public gatherings in order to protect life, so be it. In a public health emergency, these are best understood not as interferences with human rights. They are steps necessary to take in order to preserve the fundamental right to life itself. None of this means that there is no more rule of law. None of it means that we throw our critical faculties out of the window and stop scrutinising government. And none of it means that ministers or anyone else has licence to act arbitrarily. But it does mean that the standard against which we must judge the legality or the prudence or the propriety of government actions and decisions changes. In a crisis, in an emergency such as this, that standard is strict necessity. The question is not, is this a reasonable thing for a government ordinarily to do? The question is, does the government need this power? And seen in this light, Presiding Officer, the issue of how long these extraordinary powers should last becomes, I think, somewhat axiomatic. They last for as long as is needed. If they are necessary, they persist. And as soon as they cease to be necessary, they must lapse and be repealed. None of us knows how long the coronavirus crisis will last. So let us not get overly fixated on sunset provisions or arbitrary time limits on these statutory powers. These powers are necessary now. They are necessary for the time being. They will continue to be necessary for as long as the crisis endures. And for all of these reasons, we should all back them today.
Just before I call the Cabinet Secretary, I should have said earlier that you should note that decision time has been delayed. It may be you've noticed that already. And it should be around 5 o'clock. So I now call Michael Russell to wind up in this debate for about 5 minutes. Please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank members for the very constructive nature of the debate this afternoon. I will try to get through quite a number of the points that were raised, if you will bear with me. Can I thank, first of all, Bruce Crawford and the committee for taking evidence this morning. All of us who are members, were faced, I'm sure, this weekend by a tidal wave of concern from our constituents, from the people we represent. For each of us, it will have been different according to the constituencies. For me, it was the issue of access by ferries to any of the 23 islands that I represent. But others, I know, were dealing with issues of mobile homes, issues to do with staff accommodation, issues to do with protective gear. And our job is certainly to provide information, and we will continue to do that in the weeks and months ahead, I have to say. But our real job is to give leadership, is to ensure that we are leaders within this situation, and people are, if not comforted or not even reassured, but they are given what they need by those that they have elected. So very struck by some of the contributions today, the contribution from Ruth Davidson, from Adam Tompkins, from Willie Rennie, and I rarely speak about being struck by their contributions except in a negative sense, but on this occasion I'm going to be very positive about it. Because they were talking about the issue of trust, and Ruth Davidson used that extensively. They're talking about the appropriate responses that we would give, and Adam Tompkins was talking about the necessity of the job that we are undertaking and how we have to undertake it. But Willie Rennie, I think, had the last word on this, and I know he loves to have the last word, so he'll be very pleased about this, when he said that he looked forward to the time when we did not need this legislation. And I think it's important as leaders and as this government to say very clearly that we wish to let go of this legislation at the very first appropriate moment, but not a moment too soon. And therefore necessity has to be the watchword. We will have to have this legislation for the period we need it, and we have to all live up to the trust that the people of Scotland, our individual constituents, will put in us and are putting in us now by watching and listening to what we're saying. Can I respond to some of the detail that we've heard? And there have been a huge number of detail points, so I won't get through them all, but if people have more, get in touch with me, email me. All the ministers are willing to respond, and I know Jean Freeman has said, for example, in points that Alec Rowley made, that she's happy to respond to you on those detailed points. First of all, can I say that in terms of Bruce Crawford's point of the switching on and off of the powers, if you look at Schedule 22, for example, very clearly it says that the switching on of the power comes from the declaration of the incidence of transmission of coronavirus, that it constitutes a serious and imminent threat to public health. That's a trigger to switch it on. And the trigger to switch it off is when that no longer exists, and that comes from the Chief Medical Officer, and it has to come from the Chief Medical Officer. And throughout the bill, there are those triggers and those switches, and we need to be aware of them, and the bill gives them. And in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, then, we need to make sure that that is built into the new bill and acts retrospectively on this one. Now, I'm not actually in favour of a 3-month reporting period. I'm in favour of a 2-month reporting period. No, I'm sorry, I really don't have time, Mr. Finley. I've got to get through this. I'm in favour of a 2-month reporting period, and I commit myself to that. We'll put it in the legislation. And I have already said to officials today, I've been working incredibly hard on this bill, and Jenny Gilruth has also been working hard on this bill. We have to make sure that we have a schedule of reporting, that people understand what we're reporting, why we're reporting it, and what it means. In terms of food stocks raised by Patrick Harvey and also by Pauline McNeill, I wish we had the power to deal with price gouging, but I am pretty certain that that is a power that's reserved to Westminster in terms of trading standards. But what we do have a power, I think, already to do, and Mr. Harvey raised this morning, was to purchase food if we require it, because we already do so for food banks. So I'm checking that out. But I do hope that that power already exists. And if there are powers that already exist in statute, then we should be saying to people, there they are available if we need to have them. I need to make sure that, and Willie Rennie's point about care assessments, just to reassure him, the provision in the bill is not an excuse for local authorities not to act. It enables local authorities to act quicker than they might otherwise do under the existing legislation. But that is a power we need to keep an eye on, because no authority should use it as an opportunity not to do something. Just in terms of other ones, I have to say that in terms of the escalating prices, I've dealt it. And Anas Sarwar asked not just 1 point, but 5, I think. In fact, it was probably 6. I probably missed one. So very briefly, just to acknowledge his industry as well as his inquiring mind. First of all, the reporting issue will be 2 months, I've said. On creation, the legislation on cremation already means that those involved in cremation have to take account of the faith or belief of those who are cremated. This bill emphasises that point and does not change it. So I think we can look, and I heard his earlier question to the Justice Secretary, we can look to give reassurance on that. The UK government, we will be involved in UK action on supply chains, and indeed I heard the Scottish Grocers Federation making that point on Radio Scotland this morning. In terms of the Mental Health Act, we have to act very sparingly indeed. And these provisions are very extensive provisions, and many of us are uncomfortable with them. I know that Angela Constance, with her experience in the mental health professions, raised this issue in the committee this morning. We will ensure they are sparingly used, but we will also make sure that we report on their use so people know that they are there. In terms of human rights, I have spoken with the Scottish Commission on Human Rights. We are continuing to listen to them. We are talking to them about the best practice in drafting the new bill, which we will discuss with opposition spokespeople this evening, and will continue to do so. And just to make sure that we will keep under review the PVG issue. That is also a very sensitive issue, and I speak as the former Cabinet Secretary for Education. We are aware that that is a vitally important service that keeps children safe. We will keep it under review, but there's no intention to weaken that service, but we may have to streamline the service if that is eventually where we end up. Presiding Officer, this bill is a difficult bill. It's a bill full of detail. It's a bill that requires to be done now. I go back to where I started on this. I very much look forward to the day when this bill is no longer necessary and we can put it behind us. But it is necessity that will drive us. And in those circumstances, I do hope everybody will support this. But moreover, we'll continue to work with the Scottish Government as the offer exists, and as Alec Rallies acknowledged this afternoon, to make sure that not only can we get the emergency bill we're already working on, and for which we hope to bring to the Chamber for a single day next week, but we will then have to take forward some other legislation as well as gaps occur. And also, and this is the third time I've referred warmly to Willie Rennie, so I think that's the end of it today, but just also to make the point that he made, which was we need to look at this bill and its operation and say, are there things that we need to change we didn't get right, or we actually need to build on, and we'll try and do that in further legislation as we require it. And, Presiding Officer, I did move the motion early on, but I do it again just to be certain.
Thank you very much, Mr Russell. That concludes our debate on the UK coronavirus bill. Now we're going to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 21327 in the name of Ben McPherson on the local government finance order. Now I'll let Mr McPherson come down to the front desk if he wishes.